So this is where we left off, and in this video we're going to talk about something else. We now know about variables, and if you don't quite understand the title of the video, I'll just go through that quickly. So typecasting and conversion in brackets basically means that we are converting from one type to the other, and these types are the types that we talked about in the previous video when we talked about variables. But now the types that we're actually interested in this video, we want to convert to float, we want to convert to int, and we want to convert to strings. How will this work? Well, you actually have functions for each of these conversions, and the question then is, why would I want to convert between these? Well, it's always application specific. But for example, let's say you have 66 rands, and rand is just our currency in South Africa. And now you usually write this out with cents or with another value after the decimal point. So this is a float, or it's a decimal. A decimal is a float. Now, if you initially had it as 66 and you just wanted to format it so that your program actually looks standard, then you take the 66, convert it to a float. Now, why would you want to convert to anything else? Let's say you have a string, and as you saw, strings have these quotation marks. Let's say you have the same 66 and you wanted to convert it into a number. You can't do any math on this as a string. You have to convert it first so that it's actually a number. So for example, you can add it with another number. And I actually do cover math operations in another video, so just check that out after this one. So we now converted this string. It's a word, right? It's text, and we will now want to convert it to an int, which is a number, or a float. So now I'm just going to go through how to do these conversions and what you have to do. So let's go ahead and create a new file. So just going to come here and say that we want to create a new file, and we can call this new file typecasting. Let's call it typecasting, not py. Don't forget the py. If you leave out that py, then it just saves it as a normal file, which doesn't quite relate to Python. So now let's continue. To start with, we're going to convert an int to a float and to string. So okay, let's look at this. Let's say, for example, we have an age, someone's age, but I'm just going to call it my age for the sake of the video. Let's say we have my age and it's set to, or even before I use variables, let me show what I want to do right now. So we are basically saying want to convert an int into a float, and this is how you do it. You just say float, then put in the int that you want. Let's put in 100, for example, or let's put in 16, which is what I want to use for my age example. So now this line changes this 16 into a float, and if you say print float 16, let's see what happens. So I put in 16 into the float function, or into the float conversion, and I expect it to come out as a float. And a float is just a number with a decimal point. So 16 is 16.0. That is exactly what we have as our output. So this is what we want to do, or this is what typecasting is about. When you convert into a float, you take whatever it is and you put it inside this float bracket, then close the bracket. That is what you do. But now, since we know about variables, we can store this 16 in a variable. So let's create a variable, call it my age, and put in 16. And this means that wherever you see my age, that place can be replaced with the 16. That's what happens behind the scenes. So wherever you see my age, we'll have the value of 16. So any point that we see that will have a value of 16. So float, let's call it float age. This is now the conversion. This is where we say float, then put in my age. So this is the same as what we did previously, just saying float 16, just that we're using a variable. And if you haven't watched the video about variables, I'll just link it on the top right, and you can just go and look at that. So now we expect float age to have the value 16 but as 16.0. So let's clear the terminal and let's do these things. So I'm going to print float age as well as its type. And the type function was covered in the previous video as well that talked about variables. So I want to find the type of float age. So let's just summarize what we've done so far. We stored 16 in my age, then we converted my age, which has 16, into a float. This is how you do the conversion. So I'm converting the int to a float. This is how you do it. Just say float and put in the int inside. And here, this assignment here, that is just me storing the result of this conversion into float age. So 16.0 just has to be stored in here, or at least that is what we expect. And now these last two statements, I'm just printing that age, which is now a float, and I'm just confirming that it's actually a float. So let's run this. So run file. If you look at that, the first line is 16.0, which is associated with that. The next line says class float, which is associated with us checking the type. So we've successfully converted this int, which is 16. So it's an int because it doesn't have a decimal point, it's just a number. That's what an int is. And we converted it into float. We printed the float as well as the type. And now we want to convert this same int into a string. So let's remove the conversion down here as well as the statements. So we just keep the age. You can skip a line if you want, if it makes it much better for you. So my age equals 16, and now I want to convert this into string. So let's say string underscore age. And what we're going to do, use str to convert from any type to a string. So just going to pass in our int, either 16 or, now that we have it stored as a variable, my age. So now what you've done here is, just like with the float, we've now converted this to a string. The only difference is now we're using str, which is to convert this into a string. And strings just basically have quotation marks, or they basically just have quotation marks. So if I were to define this initially, this is what I would do. So either double quotation marks or just single, just be consistent on each side. So if you start with the single and with the single. So now we have effectively converted this 16 into this form. So let's erase this so that it doesn't interfere with our result. And let's actually see if that is the case. Then we're going to print the type of string age. So let's see what that does. And if you're wondering how I get by so fast, when it suggests, let's say you start typing this and it suggests string age, you can either scroll down or you can actually get to the part where it suggests. If it's the top suggestion, just press tab and it will finish that for you. Okay, so now we have this and we just want to clear the terminal quickly, run the file, and if you look at this, it says 16, but what type is it? It's now a string. It doesn't show the quotation marks, but it has effectively been converted into a string. That is confirmed by this type checking. So in the end, we've actually been able to convert the int to a float and a string. And in the beginning of the video, I explained some of the uses that you can where this can apply, or how you can use the conversion. So now let's move on to another conversion. What if you have a float? So let's start with 16.0. If you want to use another number, just to show that it works for other numbers as well, don't have to use 16. So let's say 100.0, which is a float, or you can say 100.11, just to make it interesting, I guess. And we now want to convert, this is a float now. So our comment should say, want to convert a float to an int and string. So let's look at this. Now let's do this all at once, or let's have the statements follow each other. And to do that, we first want to convert this into an int. And converting a float into an int, here's what's going to happen. So you have a float, 100.11, you convert it into an int. And we know that ints are basically numbers that don't have a decimal point. It will just delete this part and we expect 100 as the output. That is what we basically expect as our output or the result of the conversion. So now we're going to say int age, just so we can identify it. And this is how you convert into an int. Just say int and have these brackets, put in whatever it is that you want to convert into an int in there, right? And we've now converted my age, which was a float, into an int. Let's confirm that by printing int age as well as its type. So let's say type int age. There we have it. Clear the terminal quickly and run this file. If you look at that, it says 100. Initially it was 100.11, but now it's being converted into an int. Ints don't have decimal parts. It will just literally ignore that or delete that. What is the type? The type is int. So we have successfully converted that. So now let's try to convert this into string. You know how to convert into string now. Just replace the int or the int with an str. We can change the name now to string age, and it doesn't recognize all of this stuff, so let's replace that as well. So that is what we will have, and let's clear the terminal quickly, run that. If you look at this, it's now a string, and a string, unlike an int, it just takes everything exactly as it is, converts it into a string. So you still have that, but it's now a string because when we check the type, that is what we found, str for string. And we ultimately have converted the float into both an int and a string. Finally, we want to convert a string into an int and float. Here's something interesting that you must note. So let's start with the string age because this is our starting point. Let's say we have 100, or let's change it up. I can't think of another number, 23, I guess, 23.11 or 12. And we want to convert this into an int. Let's call it int underscore age. And now to do that, you should know that is what you do. You pass in what you want to convert, which is string age. And we're going to see if it has done what we expected it to do. So we expected to convert this into an int, which should be 23. And so let's see if it actually did that. And let's check the type once again. So, okay, let's go through this, clear the terminal quickly. And if you look at that, what's happening here is it says invalid literal for int with base 10, 23.12. And here's why. So it can't read this just as it can't read a string if you wrote text in here. So it wants you to first convert this into a float before you convert it into a string. You can either do this on one line, or you can just put it as a step before this and say that, then convert the string first to a float. So let's take in string age, that's what we're converting. Let me just skip a line so that we can break this down. So this will be converted into a float first, which is 23.12 as a number. Currently it's text. So this int function can't take the text directly and figure out that it has to remove this fractional part or this decimal part. It first has to be converted into a number in this exact form. To convert it into a number in this exact form, you have to convert it into a float first. Once it's a float, it will be this exactly, but it's a number now. And now the int function can identify that it has to remove this part. So now what you do is you convert into float first. You take in the float in here, and that is what you're going to convert into an int. So let's clear the terminal and let's run this. And if you look at that, converted it first into float, passed it into int. It's now 23. And we printed 23 and we checked the type, it was an int. In between here, we did this conversion, but we never printed what we needed to print. So we can go ahead and check this intermediate part, or this part in between, which is when we convert it into a float, and we can just confirm that this is indeed a float by saying type of float age. So if you now clear the terminal quickly and run that, you should see that the first print statement, and you should remember that it runs from the top to the bottom. So whatever you see first is whatever was printed first. So this was printed first, which is float age. It just took that text and converted it into a number, which is that. Then we check the type. It's indeed a float. This float was then converted into an int, and that is 23 because it just takes out the fractional part or the decimal. And if you check the type, it's indeed an int. So we've now converted the string to a float and then to an int. So if you ever have to convert this string of this type that has a decimal or is a float, you first have to convert it into a float, then to an int. You can do this in one line using the following. So you can say int age equals float. So you can put this inside. If you want to be compact with it, you can do it like this. So it first deals, just like in mathematics, it will deal with whatever's inside the brackets first. So this is inside the brackets. It will deal with all of that, which is the conversion of that into a float first. The result of that would now be converted into an int. So you can run this and confirm that it leads to the same thing. And there you have it. So 23, then you have that. So if you want to be compact, you can do it this way. If it makes more sense to you to actually have it in steps so that you can follow along later, then do that. So this was all about typecasting and conversion. And obviously you can't have text. Let's say you have hey over here. You can't convert it into either a float or an int because that's not a number. Ints and floats are numbers, and we want to convert the text, which should be a number, into either an int or a float. So watch out for that. That is not a valid operation. So let's change this back to, let's say, 200. You can just go ahead and convert this into an int. This is valid because this doesn't have a decimal part, and you can just do the conversion. Look at that, 200 plus int. So this is all that I had to talk about with regards to typecasting or conversion. I hope you were able to follow along. And if you like the video, just give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing, and I will see you in the next video.